Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you for our conversation today around our opening exhibition, Resurgence and Renaissance. Before we get started on conversation and some remarks, we would like to do something very special in the moment. We would like to invite Becky Garris, Catawba citizen, maker, and part of the exhibition. She is going to do a blessing. Sure, yeah. She's going to do a blessing for us in the exhibition.
Let's pray. One you are me and absolutely already what you are ours. One who never dies, just who will gather here, may they learn new things and learn from each other. Ours.
Thank you so much, Becky. When we talked about this show, Becky had mentioned that she would like to bless the exhibition some time ago, so I'm so glad we got the chance to do that. Thank you. Well, I want to say good afternoon to you all. This is a great turnout, and I want to welcome you all to the Columbia Museum of Art for today's talk. My name is Jackie Adams. I'm Director of Art and Learning here at the museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome each of you here today to learn more about this exhibition in conversation with Brittany Taylor-Driggers, who is Director of Collections and Galleries at the USC Lancaster Native American Studies Center, and also an Associate Professor of Art and Art History. She is a busy, busy woman. And next to Brittany, we have a surprise guest, which was not on our PR materials. So I'm so grateful and so thankful you're able to join us. Alex Osborn, who is a Catawba artist and a designer and a photographer, a passionate advocate for his culture, and so I'm so glad that you're joining here with us today.
Thank you. Honored to be here.
Thanks. I also wanted to give a special shout out to Catawba citizens that are here today. If you could just stand and let us give you a round of applause for working with you in the exhibition. Thank you. That was a little impromptu. I also want to give a special thank you to our museum members who are joining us today. If you're new to the museum today, I hope you will consider becoming a member. We have a great year of art and programming ahead, and as a member, you'll receive special benefits, one being able to see our collection and feature exhibitions anytime for free. So thank you so much. I also want to give a special thank you to the exhibition sponsors of the show, Dr. Susan D. Boyd and Mr. M. Edward Sellers, Barbara B. Boyd, Anne Marie Steertz, and John B. Caron, and along with South Arts and numerous grantors of the exhibition. Thank you to those sponsors. Their generosity allows us, the CMA, to present remarkable works of art and for many to enjoy, and we thank them tremendously. I'd also like to acknowledge our staff, both here at the Columbia Museum of Art, as well as at the Native American Studies Center and at the Catawba Cultural Center. We've all come together and worked tirelessly to present this inspiring exhibition. And I just really want to give them a special shout out and thank them for all their efforts. A very special thanks to the University of South Carolina Lancaster's Native American Studies Center, along with the Catawba Nation, who together we all partnered to present this CMA exhibition. So thank you. And I would like to say if you're traveling if you're traveling or passing through Lancaster, please take some time to visit these two institutions. The Catawba Cultural Center and the Native American Studies Center are really absolutely cultural jewels of our state, and resources that you will encounter there. You will learn so much about our indigenous culture and history in South Carolina and beyond. So they have great websites filled with events and programs, and I really, really hope that you'll take time to visit both of these establishments. And last but not least, I want to give a special shout out to somebody who is not with us here today. Resurgence and Renaissance is dedicated to the memory of Dr. W. Brent Bergen, who passed away last summer. Brent was a founding member and an archivist for the Native American Studies Center, and he was incredibly dedicated to the Catawba Nation and the indigenous communities around South Carolina. We'll talk about him a little bit more, but it was his personal passion and dream to see this exhibition come to fruition. So I am going to call on his spirit right now, and I hope he is with us. All right, well, let's get started with our conversation. All right. So today's conversation is really going to center around 3 ideas, because as we put up the show, we get a lot of questions along the way, and it does help kind of frame how we're going to do our today's discussion. The first thing is we're going to talk about how the show came to be, how we really shaped this very unique and special exhibition. We are then going to move into Catawba creativity. There's a lot to think about. There's a lot of symbols and effigies and stories and oral traditions and processes. We're going to discuss that a little bit. Then we're going to look at cultural significance through this exhibition. And that's going to talk a little bit about reclamation as well. So we're going to delve into some of these 3 particular key areas in the time that we have. And hopefully at the end, we have enough time to also open up the floor for some question and answers. All right, sound good. All right, so let's dive in. So, shaping the show. Alex and Brittany. These have been my partner in crime. We have all 3 been working very hard on the show. Talk to us a little bit about how this show came to be. There's definitely some history behind it, and there's some distinction that we need to call out between 1973 and now. How did this show came to be?
Well, you mentioned Brent in your opening. I wanted to talk a little bit about him. You see him in the slides there in the corner. Since, years ago, Stephen and Chris are in the audience right now. They could probably tell you. I don't even remember how long it's been since he started talking about this. Yeah, years. But he was like, this would be so cool if we could do an anniversary exhibit. And he would randomly send emails about information about the significance of 1973 and what happened at the Columbia Museum of Art and Baker's influence. And so a year and a half ago now, I think, the museum reached out to us about the idea of doing an anniversary exhibit. And we immediately jumped on board and was like, yes, this is a great idea. And as soon as Brent heard about it, he was like, you've got to look at my emails. He was resending emails from like 10 years ago of attachments. And I'm like, they're no longer valid. Can you send these again? So he was sending me all this information. And so I had a pool to pull from at the beginning when we started talking. You see here some of the images that you'll see in the exhibit, the pamphlet and the drawings. Those showed up a lot in our discussions about the exhibit because of the effigies and the symbolism and how it connected with the 1973 exhibit and how it really was an image. That turtle and that King Hegler head showed up as the marketing for that exhibit. But the key for us in designing that exhibit was to turn it a little bit more into a Catawba voice. So I asked Alex to take the images and create them in his own voice. So you'll see those on the title wall coming in and in the turtle oral history as you're walking out. And the story, the message of coming out of that exhibit is to what happened after. 1973 was a marker of how it influenced the economic and creativity within the tradition. The 4 potters that you see when you walk into the exhibit, the four makers that were in the 1973 exhibit are highlighted in that first case. Those four women also started talking with other potters and influencing, trying to get more pottery classes on the reservation, and really trying to bump up the energy. And you see that in the letters that they wrote to Steve Baker. You see that in the aftermath of the classes of 1976, and there was one in 79, I think. So you'll see those, and some of those pieces from those classes you'll also see in the exhibit. Yes.
Introduce Stephen Baker, because he was a key person that led to that 1973.
Yes.
So yes.
Stephen Baker was a graduate student at USC at the time that he built the exhibit. So he was a graduate student who used this. He became interested in the Catawba and the pottery, and felt like people needed to know more, because he felt like people were not paying attention enough. And he was right? And his actions and his passion got the museum involved. It got the Arts Commission involved. It got so many people interested to do this 1973 exhibit. And in his letters about the exhibit, he did offer spots to other potters, but it was narrowed down to the four that you see in the entry case. And I think he highlighted some of the best ones in terms of the teachers at that time. I'm not saying that the other ones were not great teachers either, but they were the ones out there being more vocal, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, Chief. That's fine. Add on. No pressure, right? The Chief of the Catawba right here in front of me. So he has these correspondence, and he was handwriting letters. Like, we in the archive at the USC Native American Studies archive, we have the correspondence between Steve Baker and the artist between this time, and you can see months go by. He spent years trying to get the 1973 exhibit pulled together, the artwork made, because he had, specific ideas, and the artist had specific goals. I think if a piece didn't make it through the fire, they're like, I'm not sending it to you, I'm giving you a different one. And you can see that in the writing. And so there's so much more about this 1973 exhibit that is not in this exhibit, but I think it holds the spirit of it, and it takes it forward. And we use some of the things that highlight that time period.
Alex, did you have thoughts you'd like to share?
I think you did a really great job of summarizing everything, to be honest. Working at the Native American Studies Center and being a citizen myself and an artist, it's been really interesting. And I actually credit Brittany a lot of helping me with that journey in some ways, and Elizabeth and Chief too, and Becky. I don't want to leave you out. But just, what does the exhibit for me highlights then and now? And I think that there's so much to be said about place and identity and a lot of things that I'm sure we'll get more into later, that I look at the actions of my ancestors and of our community that really place a lot of importance and emphasis on who we are as a people. And that particularly rings true when you think about the experiences that we've had as Native Americans. Mm-hmm. And so, being able to assert ourselves and, represent ourselves carries a lot of weight.
Chief?
And that's what I'd like you to share is, how old were you in 1973? and the impact that went through the reservation about this for your grandparents.
So I want to give a little bit of a disclaimer that I was not existent in 1973. So, in a very like full circle kind of way, though, this exhibition shows how I got here. My great grandmother was a potter, and so the stories that I have, and that's something that I think that I would tell anyone, is just that I can only speak for myself. I never want to speak for others, but like I can speak to the experiences that I had as a result of the impact that something like a gallery in 1973 had on our work and our practices as people. I hear stories from my dad about his relationship with my grandmother and my great grandparents, and what that process looked like for us, because I think what a lot of people don't realize is that the creation of pottery is a process that looks different for every individual, every family, and so I have insight on how our family has done it. But Chief's experience through that, and Becky's and Elizabeth's, is all just a little bit different. And so it's really unique to both see the differences, both in the work and in what it represents, but also like how we come together as community. And I think that community aspect really is something that I enjoy, but also is important. It's important to the survival of our cultures.
I'm so glad that you both made these points, because when I started working on the exhibition and dived into some of the archival material, the first thing I read was Steve Baker's brochure, or the pamphlet that was in the show. And I did not have an education on Catawba pottery. I didn't know about it. And when I read, there's a comment on the back of the pamphlet that just kind of took the breath out of me. And it left me with this huge gaping hole, and I just have lots of questions from there. And I want to read that for everyone. On the back, it says, a comment in retrospect by Steve Baker, who I spoke with about 2 weeks ago. He's still around. But he wrote this. He said, if Catawba pottery is destined to disappear, let us look to the bright side of its passing. 6,000 years old, right? I knew that. While we should be saddened to lose such a vital art form, we must note that pottery may finally have outlived its usefulness to the Catawbas. So that's on the back of the pamphlet. And I read all of this history beforehand in the pamphlet. And so I flip it over and I read that, and I just thought, that can't be the end of the story. Like, that really cannot be where we are now. I mean, what? So really, the exhibition turned into almost like a detective thing for me. It was really about, I have got to find out what happened.
I think I love that experience and hearing about that experience from you. And for me, it highlights something that I notice in, I read often about politics, and not only politics, but tribal politics, and it makes me think a lot about perspective. And, for us, 6,000 years is ongoing.
Right.
You know what I mean? We never had a gap. We never experienced that loss, if you will. And so I think that also speaks to, we are here to share things, but we need to be asked to share our story. And I think that is a really important piece of what the museum has done here, and it's rarer than it should be. But in partnering with the Native American Studies Center and the museum, we've been allowed to tell our own stories. And that's, I love cultures and foods from all over the place, art from everywhere. We all, as part of like the human experience, if you will, I think we all have something significant to share, but those stories need to be told by the people that live them. And to respectfully to Dr. Baker, we've known that it wasn't being lost, and I think that often we need to consider a little bit deeper the place that certain practices have within a community, and listen to the stories of the people that actually have them to share.
That's a great segue actually into the second idea around how we shaped the show, which is the community-centered process that you have to engage with this type of exhibition, and how important it was to building it. Can you both speak to that a little bit more? We have 3 organizations coming to the table to engage this process. And it was a lot of learning for our staff, because to your point, we had not done good Native relationship building or presenting of exhibitions and work outside of the pieces that we had collected from the 1973 exhibition. So it was a process we came to the table very humbly.
Mm-hmm.
That's the key.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, honestly, because you talk about current climate on social media and social justice and all of these things, but when people come to the table with expectations of either this is what I expect from you, I need you to educate me. We all want to learn, so there's nothing wrong in asking questions. But the approach that you all had in coming to us and discussing it, and we want to learn more, that's how you actually get those answers, as opposed to demanding something, which can be hard to process sometimes.
Yeah.
And that was our main advice when you guys came to us, is just listen.
Mm-hmm.
Meet with the artist and listen.
Mm-hmm.
Your staff came to the center for the festivals, talked to the artist. We had Becky Sharon Norton, who is not here right now. She is a Catawba on our staff who is wonderful and pulled a huge support role and research role on this exhibit. And I hate that she can't be here, but she was also significant in helping building the timeline and parts of this exhibit. And Alex was part of that panel, and Becky was a part of that panel. And your staff met with them and just had a good conversation. I heard a lot of laughter, a lot of jokes, yes. And so a lot of learning happened that day just by listening. And that's another big part about this exhibit, is using their words and their voices and the artwork to show the graphic design work, instead of having someone else do it or design something that someone else feels like is important. Actually have a Catawba do it, and using those images to represent the people.
I think authentic conversations, just like what you're saying.
Yeah.
The right history, whenever people would come to the reservation to get information. And I like what Dr. Winona Hare says, the director of the Culture Center. It's about us, through us, without us.
Right.
We get our information, but you leave us out of the final product of what it should be saying or how it should be said. They take on their own agenda before they even get there. And their agenda is the final product without actually involving us with the final product.
The subject matter.
You can't separate us from our culture.
Right.
It's just not something that's possible.
Right.
So we are part of that, and it is part of us.
The slide that you see behind me illustrates some of the photos that I could gather together, just some of the sites and locations and people that we encountered through this learning process. I mean, it was far beyond a traditional process of curating an exhibition. Much more funner, I thought, cooler. Just so much to learn, and I just really appreciate everybody that allowed us to be part of that experience. So thank you. I wanted to get a little bit into Catawba creativity, because there's a lot to see in the show in terms of what identifies Catawba creativity in so many different layers. So thinking about it sort of from the historical aspect to now modern and contemporary practices and applications. So some of the slides that you'll see as we'll start to break this down a little bit. So what you see behind us are some of the pottery vessels. And if you both could speak a little bit to the tradition of pottery and how that is centered in the show and why for our audience.
You can talk about pottery and I'll talk about the exhibit. So the 1973 exhibit solely focused on Catawba pottery, right? Historically, Catawba pottery is functional. Around 1973 forward, it started to become more decorative, organic, more for artistic purposes, but it was never called art. It was called craft, or just pottery or ceramics. It was never put in the art category, almost like they wanted to keep it as a subset. this exhibit is meant to move that term and move the pottery into that term, right? Because it's always deserved to be there. But the argument or the discussion has never gotten there. So I wanted to use this chance to highlight the shifts from 1973 to now and the mindset that has shifted. So using that term and moving it into the art form, you talk about like what Chief Bill Harris did when he was talking to a visitor earlier. He talked about it being functional, but then spinning it and making it more his own and making it more creative and putting his voice into the pottery piece. The images that you see on the screen all do that. They have a functional bowl or a functional form, and then it takes it to a more creative, I cannot talk today, I'm so sorry, creative form and a voice, right? It becomes their style. There's also an image, the center image with the wedding vase and the face cup. Both of those highlight the teaching process. Both pottery pieces were created by both mentor and protege as a teaching piece. So both potters would work on it, teach the protege how to make the form, but then also step back and let the protege take its own voice on the piece. So the cup you see there was created by Caroline Sanders and Becky Garris, who is in the audience right now. And Caroline never uses press molds or like a stamp to create the faces. She hand molds and pinches the faces into form and into being. And she was teaching Becky this process. What?
Well, she was actually she was working on it herself. And I was sitting there watching her. And she only did the left half.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't even looking at that. As far as when she handed it to me, she said, okay, now you finish. Without any directions. And so that's what you get. The man in the moon winking at you.
The difference between oral history and reality.
I think though, a little bit of an insider opinion maybe. We, as Catawba artists, and I'm not a potter, so I'm not speaking for potters, and I wouldn't dare speak for potters, but we're very critical of our own work. I think that's true for any artist, really. Oh, yeah. But looking at historical pieces, you look at the pieces that weren't fit for sale, for as an example, or you look at pieces that that one's not ready yet, that one's not good enough. And I think that we as a people have for a long time been proud of our work because we work very hard. Very hard. My great-grandparents and my grandparents were some of the hardest people I've ever, working people I've ever known. And I can hear my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather saying things about that won't do. that was one of the phrases that they would say. And so I think that you see examples of learning, and it really shows in our work, both in representing ourselves but also the process that we go through together to share what we have to share.
We could certainly break that down and give a lot more detail. I thought one detail we could maybe focus on, and people might find very interesting, are some of the animal effigies that you see pop up on the pots. When you go in the exhibition, there's each case has a display, and it's variations of maybe a different animal or an effigy. And Alex, you had when you spoke to our staff, you talked about the snake. And there are many oral traditions around animals that are native to this area. I thought maybe, could you speak to some of the animals that people see on?
Sure. So I'm not a pottery expert, but one of my favorite symbols in our culture is the black snake. And as Chief has reminded me so many times, and I say that, lovingly, the black snake is a symbol of power and protection. We used to tattoo it on the backs of our warriors, and we also have started. I say have started. I don't know how long ago that was. Sculpting them around pots, and I find it really interesting because that has become a really significant symbol for us. That sets us apart a little bit from maybe some of the tribes and communities around us, because for some people you immediately think of copperheads, you think of venomous snakes and perhaps satanic or devil representation, but for us it was more, the black snake killed other snakes that would harm us. The black snake would keep vermin from your crops and things like that, and in terms of representing power and strength, that was also a very good symbol of like, don't mess with us. So that's my favorite one that comes to mind.
Yeah.
There are plenty of other stories that with Turtle. I always laugh a little bit about Turtle because in one of our traditional stories he held back water from everyone else, and so
you'll see that in the exhibit.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting one to explore too. That you'll see represented a lot, but because. And this part I can speak to as a more modern Catawba artist is that we draw on the stories of our ancestors. We draw on the things that speak to us. And I think that when I look at pottery, Chief's work, Becky's work, Elizabeth's work, anybody's work, it is always informative and interesting to me to see what's inspired them to create. Caroline is one of my favorite Catawba artists.
I'd love to.
And if you look at these are great examples, but her effigies are stunning, and you won't see effigies like hers in anybody else's work. But she draws on the inspiration of her ancestors and the things that she has learned from to create pieces that no one ever has.
Caroline, for me, is one of the artists in the show that when you think about any other place in art history, she's doing something really revolutionary. For an art form that maybe has established, traditional rules and guidelines and guardrails that everyone must learn within first, then you become a really good at what you do, and you begin to bend that, and you begin to find your own artistic voice and style. And Caroline is one of those potters in the show that clearly does that.
I think something I would encourage any visitor of this exhibit to think about is the meeting of old and new. Yeah. Caroline is an amazing example. When you take the constraints of tradition, which who knows when tradition starts, right? Like that's right. A practice. It's not necessarily like this started on November the 3rd, 1953. You know what I mean? Like that's not, or 73 AD or what have you. But when you take those constraints, but then find the flexibility to work within them, that really creates something special, I think, because you're taking that old piece and seeing it now. And I think that that's something that the exhibit highlights very well is, we talk often about how our pottery has been around for 6,000 years. That's a metric that is very easy to share, but it has consistently been here for 6,000 years. And the piece that people often leave off that sentence is that, and it is still made today. So, what does that look like 6,000 years ago versus now? What does that look like versus 1973, the ancestors that we revere, versus what we're doing with our art now? And I think that that's a really relevant conversation.
Interestingly enough, Caroline's piece, if you look in the slide, you'll see the King Hagler head pot, which is a traditional form, a traditional effigy, but on the left side, you'll see a bust of her sort of homage to Georgia Harris. And so you start to see this introduction of other very highly revered makers from the nation, being revered through clay and portraits made. And the pot that's behind her, do you want to talk about that as well, Brittany?
So that case has several busts in it, or effigy head vessels, and they all highlight key people within the tradition, except for King Hagler, and that's the traditional form you see right? You usually see those on the 2 effigy head vessels. And so in that case, you'll see one potter, Joanne Bauer, she took the King Hegler off the vessel and she made a bust out of it. And so that shift between vessel to portrait happened within the tradition. And Caroline also did this with other potters. She decided not to just stick with the King Hegler head, but also Georgia Harris, Martha Jane Harris, and Emma Brown, I believe, is the other one. So she's also immortalizing them and making them, elevating them into a more important stature.
Something that I realized, I guess, was in 2021, I think. I was an artist in residence at the Native American Study Center. Time, what is time? But, I, as someone who is not a potter, I do digital artwork and,
there you go, Alex. Your turn.
More modern things. And I think that this is true for a lot of our artists too, because it is a tradition that's passed. And I want to note that Chief Harris is the grandson of Georgia Harris, who that bust was. So, he carries those traditions from her. And so I think that, what I realized during my residency is that even though my art form is completely different, and I kind of chuckle sometimes to think about what my ancestors would think about what I'm doing and how I do it. But the work that I make, I want to honor my ancestors. I want someone to see the things that I create and say, how did you get there? Let me look at the work of my great-grandmother, or the work of Georgia Harris, the work of, Chief, of other people. Modern work, my modern work, calls back to traditions too. And I think that that's an interesting partnership, and one that I really enjoy exploring.
I wanted to get into cultural significance, and I'm going to circle back around to your work, Alex, because I think what you did in the show in terms of some of the exhibition graphics, some of the things that we did with Catawba language, infusing that, centering Catawba voices. The show is called Resurgence and Renaissance. If I had to add another R in there, I would put reclamation. Reclamation is a big word for Indigenous communities. There are headlines made about it. It's very much attached to land. But in the show, as we centered voices, I feel as though we tapped into some of that. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit. So, and point out some areas in the exhibition where you see your voice coming through as a contemporary Catawba creative, and also how we centered those voices.
Yeah.
So I'd love for you to talk about the timeline. The timeline is just wonderful. I'd love for you to break it down for us.
So there are a couple of things with the timeline that I would point out. I think that one of the biggest takeaways is that, well, let's talk about history, and Brittany might have to fill in some of the pieces on this.
So, history of the timeline. In 1973, Steve Baker had 4 timelines in the exhibit that highlighted the traditional paths of mentor, protege, and familiar lines of the 4 potters that were in 1973. And this was one thing that Brent kept sending me images of, and I was like, these are important, and I'm like, I know that they're important, but and so he kept sending them, and I'm like, how do we do this? How do we put this in context today? So I reached out to Alex. I'm like, do you think you can put this in your voice? Like, what would this look like? What would this look like in your voice, or some like? And he was like, I don't know.
I remember being like, what do you mean, Brittany? I don't know, like, how? Because when you talk about that kind of scope, that's a huge project, Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's perfect, because that was his reaction. He was like, I mean, you could get the kind of, I don't know what you're talking about, even on FaceTime. And I'm like, well, just sit with it. So I sent him the images that Brent had sent me. And a couple of weeks go by, and I'm like, have you looked at them? He's like, yeah. And another week goes by. I was like, have you figured out something? I'm working on it. And I'm like, okay, well, just talk to me. What is your hesitation? And he was like, it's too square. And he was trying to follow the traditional lines that Steve Baker had done. And Baker, have you ever done a what is that, genealogy kind of thing, where it's all like lines, square boxes, pedigree.
Right.
That's
like that
what
word in
this
this
chart
context.
looked
Yes.
like. But it had little symbols for the potters. And he kept trying to keep that square. I'm like, what is bothering you? He's like, it's too square. And I'm like, well, what happens if you take those lines out and just draw whatever line you feel like? And he's like, I'll call you back. And he hung up the phone, and then probably about 2 hours later, you're like, I got an idea. And he sends me this image is very close to this, and I'm like, oh, yes. And it wasn't quite as full as this, but he was getting his voice at that point. And he wasn't trying to be Steve Baker's voice anymore. It was yours. Mm-hmm. And so that was the key thing. And then you just ran with it. The symbol, like, what do you call those? You call it? I call them.
Break down the legend.
So in my personal work, and actually through the residency, I started doing what I call seals. I don't really have any other word for it, but to me, they've become like a story within a story. So they can kind of give an insight, and maybe even if it's just like a moment where I'm walking through and looking at a piece and I get to chuckle about whatever I was thinking about at that moment. Like it's really, there's a gamut of like a retelling to like I was feeling some kind of way someday. So there was a couple of things with this, and Brittany was right, because these were actual like family timelines. They're very rigid, and the thing is, I want to be really clear before I go into this next part that we have a really interesting relationship with historians as Native people, because we traditionally had no written language. So for photographers and professors and people to come through and have relationships with us and document those has been essential to our survival. We don't often like to admit it because it's kind of a hard thing to talk about. But I think that that's notable in the case of Dr. Baker and Brittany and Stephen and all of the people at the Native American Studies Center too. We have, thankfully, come to do a lot of our own work now. But I think historically too, we just live what we live. And so then for people to come through and document some of those things can be really important. There's a conversation to be had around respect with that, but like we wouldn't have some of the records that we do have now without them. And I think that that's important to recognize. So, these were timelines that were very rigid and square. And my dad was good friends with John Brown, is his name. And no, I'm sorry, John George. John Brown was someone else. So many Johns. Yes. So John George was a medicine man for our tribe, and he, one of my first jobs, like adult jobs, if you will, was teaching at it was called the Achievement Center at the Longhouse, and he came to my classes, and so I was, putting together a display board one day, and this is relevant, I promise.
Yeah. This is good.
I was putting together a display board one day, and I was like, John, how do I make this look Catawba? And it was like, construction paper and like little cutout letters and things like that. And he was like, take out the corners. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? And he said, take out the corners. Evil spirits reside in corners. And so I think that's something that I've tried to, anytime I'm doing culturally relevant work, I try to remove all of the corners from any of my work, because just kind of as an homage, but also as just like a representation of like my commitment to my culture in that regard. And so that was part of what led to this like flow with the timeline, because not only do you see the river with it, but you also see like roots from a tree. And it kind of takes on a much more organic feel than, a timeline might normally. And I think that it kind of applies to a lot of our work. I mean, we work in clay. But you can't really get any more organic than that.
Oh, yeah.
But the other thing that was important to me and that Brittany and I discussed a lot, and I'd be happy to hear your thoughts, is, at the left, I was really, I didn't know what to put there because originally we had ancestors or, and some texts, and this is where the respect piece comes in, is you just had like old Indian, which to us is just like, we've been here for thousands of years. Just referring to our ancestors as like old Indian feels a little bit dismissive. And so I wanted to represent that by some, using something that represents us already. And that was, speaking of reclaiming, Nopkehi, which is King Haigler's Catawba name. Nopkehi is what I would like to refer to him by, just because I think that language is really important, as we've talked about a little bit. And I think that by, naming him that way retains his identity as a Catawba person, as opposed to the name that, people gave him because of their relationships.
It was interesting in the show as you did more and more research, you came across quite significant moments throughout history where there was this Euro-centeredness happening around the culture that literally you were like, why am I, I found myself going, why am I referring to a potter as a master potter when that's a very Eurocentric term? So language, we really delved into language on the exhibition as well.
Which another great example of that, which is maybe sidelining a little bit, I don't know, but the term, our term in Catawba, and Becky may know this a little bit better, is the term for teacher and artist are the same. So like the word for teacher and artist are the same word. Because we learn from each other, that's something that we share, and I think that's integral to our experiences as people.
Wonderful. We have a lot. My mind is just kind of spinning. There's lots of stuff we could talk about. I'm going to keep us moving. This is our last slide. This sort of points out a little bit in how we used language in this exhibition. So you can see on the labels in the show that we have Catawba language, and then we have the English translation. We were going to try to do that with the title of the show, Resurgence and Renaissance, but I don't know if you want to speak to this.
Well, Becky was our language expert on the exhibit, and when we asked her about this, and she was like, well, there's not a direct translation. She was like, there's something that could mean something, but it's not, we don't use those words. And so we left it off the title wall because
it would have been too long.
Well,
it's a description of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, it's a description.
So it would have taken up the whole wall for them.
We also use a lot of sounds in Catawba that we don't use in English. And so it can be very hard. I mean, I think it's still notable, but I think out of respect for our language too, it's important to, we're happy to share. We're happy to share, what some of these terms are and everything. And I think that that's a really great example of seeing the translations on the actual piece, like the piece labels. But it's definitely not English.
Yes.
The Catawba, that can be a challenge.
I was looking at the Catawba Language Project online, and you can hear sound, and so they'll enunciate. And you're right, Alex, you and I were saying it has a similarity to Japanese, and it does. I was listening, I was like, oh yeah, I can kind of hear that. So
it's also, there's some nasal sounds. So like,
yes.
I can't really think of a great example, but you just make them differently than the sounds that we make in English. And so that on top of the significance and meaning, not having that quite right, and then it could probably lead to more confusion than help, Yeah.
Well, I wanted to end with recommendations that we could give our audience in approaching their own learning and understanding really about broad Native culture and also about the Catawba. So I thought we could end there.
Sure.
Listen. Talk to the artist. Go to the reservation. Go to the Catawba. Go to the cultural center on the reservation. Talk to the people and listen. If you want to get more information about state tribes, the South Carolina Commission for Minority Affairs can help you out there and put you in contact with the other tribes and groups. and give you as much information as you're willing to learn about.
It's perfect. I think the only things I would add is, go in without expectations.
Yes.
I think, the two things that I would recommend are that, one, we are not homogenous. The culture of Catawba and the culture of Cherokee or Arapaho or Tlingit or, a whole host of other tribes are all completely different. It was almost as if we had different countries, and there can be similarities, but I think it's important to remember that. I think the other piece too is it's important to assess where you stand. So even if you believe you have an understanding of, I have an ancestor or such and such, take a look at that and what that looks like when you're talking to someone who either in their experience, so they could have an ancestor or they could have grown up in their culture. And so I think it's really important to keep that in mind and be respectful of each other's experiences.
This is really
as
good.
you learn.
Yes, yeah. Really, this whole process has made me go through a deep reflection on my own identity, and really kind of thinking about my own positionality in that identity and the different communities and cultures that I still to this day am learning about. So thank you both so much for this conversation. Thank you.